listening to the 10 Questions with the Musical Mind podcast with your host, Peter Harris.
Hello everyone, welcome back to 10 Questions with the Musical Mind. This is Peter Harris, your host. This week's episode, I welcome aboard David Rosen. David is the host of the Piecing It Together podcast. It's a very entertaining podcast where they analyze various different movies on different criteria. Plot, acting, editing, you name it. I highly suggest you check it out. It's the Piecing It Together podcast. But one of the benefits here is, instead of me running the whole show, interviewing a different guest every week, with David being a fellow podcast host, we kind of take the thing 50-50 here, and we go back and forth on our favorite film scores. And there are some different film soundtracks, as well. Of course, a film score being a original composition for a film, and a film soundtrack being a collection of songs. Now, it's worth noting that David is, in addition to the host of the Piecing It Together podcast, is a film composer himself who writes scores, and we go over some of that too, his songwriting techniques and that kind of thing. So I think you'll enjoy this, and let's check out our different picks for best movie scores with David Rosen. Hello, David. Thanks for joining us here tonight. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. This is going to be fun.
Absolutely. It's not very often that I get to have another podcast host on with me. I'm usually, coaxing other guests out of it. So it's great to have somebody who knows how to fill the other half of the void.
Yeah, I'm a musician who is completely stuck in the world of podcasting right now, and it's just taken over. So I guess I have a little of both worlds for you.
Yeah, of course. I want to go into starting. You are the host of the Piecing It Together podcast. How long has that been going on? I, of course, have listened to several episodes, and I have to be honest, as you know, caught up in my own podcast, my listening time is somewhat limited. It's more taken up with editing my own and that kind of thing. But, I just recently listened to your Quentin Tarantino countdown. That was great. And the Spider-Man Far From Home episode was good because I had no idea about that movie. I mean, I knew about it, but the previews did not lead me to, didn't lead me in the direction that your synopsis of it did. Does that make sense?
Right on. Yeah. Well, and the thing is I definitely think our show, and I'll talk a little about, what the premise is in a minute here, but I definitely think it's best to listen to episodes on movies you've seen, only because we definitely do get into spoilers and all that in the process of analyzing the movie and getting into all of its inspirations and all that. But yeah, absolutely. I remember it was a very fun one to do. That Spider-Man Far From Home, actually, my guest was the host of the Great Albums podcast, another great music podcast. Yeah. It's been going on for about a year and a half now, piecing it together. And the conceit of the show is that me and a different co-host each week, and we try to figure out what other movies inspired it. And by taking this route, instead of just being yet another film review podcast, because, there's literally hundreds of them out there, with this, we're still reviewing a movie, but we get to do it in terms of talking about lots of other movies in the process. Right. And so people seem to really dig it. And it's one of the ways that I like to talk about movies anyway. And it's just been a lot of fun because if I'm not working on music for something or listening to music, I'm pretty much watching a movie, and I love movies and I love talking about movies. So it's just been, it's been a lot of fun doing it for this past year and a half, and it just keeps growing and people are listening.
I like the concept of you have spoilers and the advice of listening to the podcast on a movie you've already seen, because honestly, what I think most people enjoy more than vague news about a movie is confirmation bias. Does that make sense? Everybody wants to listen to somebody agree with him about why a movie is good or bad.
Yeah, I like digging in, and right. If a movie really speaks to me, if I enjoy it a lot, I'm going to go on a days long, deep dive into the internet, looking for various, theories and discussions and, all that kind of stuff. And that's what I try to I try to capture a little bit on our podcast.
Yeah, definitely. I enjoy it. Now, I also want to go into, you're a music composer and do like film scores and TV. And I've looked at
Mhm.
your site, and I'm not sure. You've got some things listed on your site, like you've got a song Chosen, you list as action, and Certainty, which is drama adventure, Skybound,
Mhm.
you list as corporate. Now, is that meant to be calling cards for like interested parties? Is that what that is? The way you have that categorized, or what is the purpose of that?
Sure, yeah. Well, on the website, I've got that little playlist of tracks there where you're finding those pieces, and then I also have a reel up at the top of
Mm-hmm.
the site, which is like clips from various films that I've scored.
Yeah.
But yeah, actually, pieces of music from things that I've done music for, whether they're films or web series or TV or whatever. And I just kind of categorized them based on like kind of the genre and the style that they were. But like that Chosen one, for example, you mentioned, that was from a commercial for a comic book series.
Oh,
So it's just like action adventure type music, and so that way, that website serves a dual purpose of being, like you said, like a calling card for if somebody wants to hire me to do music for their film or commercial or whatever it is, and also a place for me to share news about my albums of music that I put out. So it's definitely a multi-purpose website. I even do software reviews on there as well, so I guess it's even more multi-purpose. But yeah, that those tracks are definitely categorized in a way where people who are interested in possibly hiring me, they'll be able to find different samples in a wide variety.
right. Now I got to tell you, I was watching that reel you have up there, and
Mm-hmm.
I shouldn't even go in this. I hesitate to mention this, but the action sequence at the beginning,
Uh-huh.
what was it? A Better Criminal or
Better Criminal. Yeah,
yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's an indie film. It's available on I believe on Amazon Prime, and I'm not sure where else, but yeah.
One thing bugged me about the beginning, nothing, or towards the end of it, that segment, and it's nothing to do with your music. The guy after he walks through the warehouse and just offs, several guys, and it's a cool scene. But
Mhm.
then he walks out in the middle of that yard and starts shooting guys off rooftops and stuff. I was in the army when I was a younger man, and it wasn't any kind of Billy badass. It wasn't special forces. I wasn't anything, but I was in the army, and I was just screaming
Uh-huh.
like, "You don't walk out in the middle of the open like that! Like you hug for cover. You stay like you don't just walk out in the middle of the yard and then see who's shooting at you."
Yeah, yeah. I guess an indie film of that level probably can't hire a proper combat specialist or
Right.
whatever to really a consultant or whatever. But maybe I'll be scoring a John Wick movie one day. I'm sure that
Mm-hmm.
they've got a little closer to what you should be doing in action.
Oh, by the way, yeah. Speaking of which, I'm sure you've seen the things of Keanu Reeves training for the John Wick movies. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
wow, that's impressive.
Oh yeah, he's awesome. I
Yeah,
love him.
yeah, just totally. I mean, just you're like, okay, it's not CGI. Like he's actually knows what he's doing. That's cool.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. That's cool. And what any big projects with the music coming up, or I mean, I know you've got that video up for The Void. Is that something more recent?
Yeah, The Void was actually the last music video I put out from one of my albums, and I've had a new album in the works for a while now, but I actually just in the past like couple of weeks have been thinking about kind of putting that on hold and instead putting out like a compilation of some like bonus songs and singles that I've released here and there over the years. So
Sure.
basically, like almost like going through the archives kind of a project. So that's probably what's going to come out maybe next year. Right now, I've got 4 full-length albums out that are available on iTunes and Spotify and all that.
Right.
And the next thing I'm doing, aside from being completely consumed by my podcast, is I have a comedy project coming out
Hmm.
actually. It's called the Pup Pups, and it's all songs about, or in some case, sung by my dogs and cats, which I know it sounds completely ridiculous, and that's because it totally is. And it's something I've been wanting to do for years because I'm just a big animal person, and the songs are like, I mean, it ranges from like, God, from like folk music to like punk music to indie rock. It's like just all over the place, different styles of music, and just all these like really goofy novelty type songs. And so, yeah, I've been kind of taking a break from my very dark, very serious music that I usually make to where.
Yeah, so basically you're taking your dogs and cats and making the new chipmunk punk.
Yeah,
Are you-
sure. That's definitely a way to.
I don't know how old
look
you
at it.
are. Are you old enough to remember that? I don't know if we're.
Are we talking about like the Chipmunks?
Yeah,
Yeah, I remember the Chipmunks.
yeah. I'm just asking. I'm 47, and I had that album when I was in the early 80s, whenever it came out. But
Well, I'm 30. I'm 38, but my family actually owns a record store called Wax Trax Records, and so I've just been around old music my whole life. You know what I mean? So yeah, I've always just been around it.
Yeah, it just depends on what you're exposed to. I remember asking somebody something one time. This is just my random segue into about things people know. I asked somebody about some song. They're like, I wasn't even born when that came out. How would I know? I was like, well, I wasn't born when the Star Spangled Banner came out, but I know who wrote it. Like,
I think the first time I ever felt old was when someone didn't know who Sam Kinison was.
Oh yeah.
And I was like, oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. But yeah. So now I want to tie into the spirit of, oh, you know what? No, I don't. And you have to forgive me. I like to jump around a little bit.
No problem.
Your music, film scoring, I have to wonder this because being an amateur, mediocre musician, it's got to be kind of, is it hard to write? Because some film scores can border on ambient, or at least parts of it have to be ambient, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Is that tough to make it ambient and yet not just aimless? Does that make sense?
No, that makes total sense. And, you know, I guess it's just a different way of approaching making music. To me, the most important thing is what is going to be best for the film at this moment. And if that means some ambient drones going on, then that's what it is. And if it means I get to like stretch my legs and, you know, go big and do some big, exciting music, then that's what it is. And if it means this scene really should just be silent, then that's what it is too. And I skip that scene and I tell the director that this is why I'm not making any music for that scene, and hopefully he agrees with me, you know. Sure. But you know, I try to really just service the film. Whatever it needs is what it needs. And as a matter of whether or not it's hard or not, I wouldn't say it's hard to make that decision. It really, for me, hard comes down to I tend to gravitate towards darker stuff. So sure. For me, the word hard when it comes to music means trying to make something happy. And of course, the Pups music is quite happy, but when I'm making film scores, it's a little tough for me to get into happy without going goofy.
No, I'm with you. I'm with you totally.
Yeah,
and it's and you're right. It can be challenging. Like I'm like, oh, I'd like to make some ambient stuff, and I've made songs that are like partially ambient, but you think it'd be easy. But if I've ever gone into my digital workstation and like, okay, I'm gonna write a melody now, and I try to write something at 60 beats per minute. You'd think that'd be easier, but it's actually harder.
Yeah, you know what else is surprisingly difficult is like add kind of hip hop music that's like, you know, just somebody rapping over just like a simple kick drum snare, and you're like somebody got paid for that. Like it sounds like the simplest thing in the world, and then you go to try it, and it just sounds like pure garbage. And it's like, wow, I mean, they figured something out to make it sound like a song when they do it, you know. And it's surprising how sometimes simple can definitely be a little more challenging to pull off.
I can see that, yeah. And yeah, you hear about jingles and stuff. You're like, well, that's stupid. You're writing, 25 seconds worth of stuff. But like, yeah, but how do you make that catchy in 25 seconds? Like, you don't like many choruses are catchy, but they're catchy in the context of the song. Like you don't have any kind of way to preface that or set up the key or set up the tonality or get into a mood. There's no contrast or juxtaposition. It's just like, boom, has to be catchy right now. So that is tough, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. Well, one thing I do want to ask you about that is, so I'm guessing from your comments, you are usually viewing the film before you score it. Like you're watching scenes and then writing to that.
Yes, there have been times where I've done it the other way around. where, somebody will just kind of describe what it is they're looking for, and I'll make music. And then once they make the film, they edit to the music. And, that's fun too. Everything has its own different set of challenges. But usually, yeah, I have the film, I've talked to the director, and we've kind of gone through it and just throwing back and forth a few ideas of what the scenes need, at least, like, not getting into like deep, like musical motifs or anything like that, but just generally speaking, like, oh, I want this to be exciting. I want this to be,
right.
This and that and that. And then I just kind of lock myself in the room and start, trying to figure out music that really works. And like I said, services the scene in the way that it needs to be.
Gotcha. So I've always wondered that, not being privy to the inside scoop, like when I see just fantastic, especially scores, not soundtracks, but score, like
sure.
Are they watching the scenes and writing to that? Or are they given a directive like Moody, like was the Imperial March written by John Williams after he'd seen the scenes, or was he just writing? I mean, I didn't know that. So,
Yeah. And I suppose it's different, every project's going to be a little bit different, but yeah, normally I do have the film right up there in my DAW, and I'm just over and over again, rewinding it and playing around to a scene and rewinding it, playing around to a scene until it's starting to come together.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, with that in mind, I'd like to touch on some of your favorite film music, and we can go back and forth on that if you like.
Sure.
And I guess we can do this one of two ways. I'm thinking of film scores and film soundtracks. And I guess it's easier to kind of do some of our most important scores and then our soundtracks. I don't think I have really that many soundtracks that are big to me, but it's more scores.
Yeah.
And I do think it's imperative sometimes how the visuals add up to the score. My number one example of all time, and this is nothing deep or nothing that's gonna surprise every film aficionado out there, is got to be the Ecstasy of Gold by Ennio Morricone, from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The graveyard scene where it's just spinning, and I often wondered throughout my whole life, the spinning scene where the cymbals are hitting and the opera singer's going, like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Was that written like that, or was that edited like that to fit the music? It's just such a intoxicating result.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and it's just so, his scores were so just cool. Like, they're kind of ahead of their time, and just like, they just, he's a real trailblazer when it comes to composing film, and such unique, and you just know it's him as soon as you start hearing his stuff.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. What's one that stands out for you?
Sure. Well, I've actually been in the process for a while now of trying to come up with like a good, favorite scores list. So I'm kind of like gonna jump around. I've got like a few specifics that I'm gonna mention throughout this conversation. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna go with a really, 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 really obvious one first.
Okay, sure.
All right. And it's not Star Wars, but it is John Williams, and it's the Jurassic Park score, which is just, to me, it's such a classic. I mean, I believe 12 when it came out, so for me that is like, it's just like, wow, this is what film music can be. This is what it could kind of take you away to. And I myself, I'm not really like the classical film style composer. My scores, when I work, they tend to blend like electronic elements and ambient elements and a little bit of old school score stuff. But still, when I think of that, when I think of like what amazing film music is, Jurassic Park is definitely one of my absolute tops.
No, and going to obvious examples is not faux pas, because obvious doesn't mean bad. A great quote I heard one time was, "It's not Led Zeppelin's fault that radio overplayed Stairway to Heaven."
Yeah, right.
So, there you go. It doesn't discount the greatness of the music. It just, you've heard it too much. But so, Yeah, so that's there. And yeah, Star Wars, John Williams in particular, my whole childhood, I mean, I saw Star Wars as a new release in the drive-in as a kid.
Mhm.
So it dominated my childhood. Absolutely dominated it. And there was a long time where the symphonic intro to 20th Century Fox I thought was the beginning of Star Wars. The whole,
Right.
that just, I thought that was the intro to the Star Wars part.
They come from the same kind of a place for sure.
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's definitely true. Yeah, so The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, it was one of my more obvious examples, but I've been in love with it since before I knew that was an obvious example of one of the greats. I just knew that
Yeah.
I loved it. And my second on the list is kind of cheating, but it's going to the same guy, Ennio Morricone, but I wasn't sure of it because it sounds so much more modern, if you can call it modern now, but Frantic, 1987 by Harrison Ford, or with Harrison Ford.
Sure.
That soundtrack is him also, but much more synth and, some fretless bass driven, that kind of thing. And I knew I loved it. And it was years later when I just happened to stumble across the fact that was also Morricone.
Mhm.
I love that movie, and I swear the soundtrack was part of it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I don't know that specific one offhand, but again though, just that whole Morricone style is just so like, I'm sure if I heard it, I would just be, oh yeah, of course this one.
You maybe could. If you ever check it out, it's called Frantic. It's Harrison Ford, and he's a doctor going to Paris, and his wife is kidnapped. So he's spending the whole movie trying to get her back. Gets entangled with a drug mule, and it's just that whole thing. But he's kind of he's still the everyman action hero. He's not any kind of tough guy or anything. He's just sort of rising to the occasion to get through this the best he can, if that makes sense.
Sure.
He's not Harrison Ford. He's not Indiana Jones in this. He's a doctor who's I guess frantic, but frantic to save the situation. So it's kind of an interesting movie.
Right on.
Yeah.
Right on.
Well, let's go back to you. Go ahead.
I'll go with my next one then, which I'm going to go back to my my early teen years again for another one, and that is Terminator 2 and Brad Fiedel's score, which I'm a big fan of like industrial music. That's what got me into making music, and just that score. I mean, it's just so insanely heavy and just so awesome. It's like awe-inspiring,
Absolutely.
And it's fantastic. And I think it maybe is one of the most influential for me on what I, aspire to do when I am composing music.
Absolutely. And that was one of the first examples of, I'm not going on music here, but that was one of the first examples to me that really stood out of the sequel being actually better than the initial installment.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, even as a movie too, like I consider Terminator 2 to be the best action movie of all time. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And that industrial sound I do like a lot. It's even in my own music, I like to pepper in some of that stuff. And it helps mask my lack of proficiency. No, I'm just kidding. But like, get it, I'm edgy because I can't play 64th notes. But
there you go.
I'm going to go, and I actually looked at Terminator 2 and I decided to ignore that one. So I'm glad I did because that's on your list. I'm going to probably the late 90s. I'm not positive yet. I'd have to look at it. But Mel Gibson, Payback.
Oh, I love that movie.
The jazzy movie. That was a guy named Chris Boardman.
Mm-hmm.
And that repetitive, intro they play a few times. It's frenetic, and it's got a forward momentum while at the same time being like really 70s and retro. And it really lends to that movie. And I love that movie because it never states actually what time period it's in. It's almost like if you look at it, all the characters are decidedly 70s, but there's no real references to that's actually when it's taking place. And I think that film score just so fits into it. Even the way they treated the film itself, that sort of bluish, I don't know what you'd call that processing, where it's that stock old looking film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I know what you mean. That film has such just a great feeling to it, and the score, the look of it, the acting. I mean, all of it just comes together. I think that's a real underrated movie. I mean, people love to, with Mel Gibson,
Yeah.
certainly. But I mean, it's just, I think it's a kind of an undeniably great, like, classic, to be honest.
Right. His stock may have gone down or something, but that's got no bearing on that movie for me. It's
Absolutely.
yeah, it's the performance stands on its own. But I don't know what's next on your list.
So next up for me is probably my favorite composer, Clint Mansell. And I'm going to specifically point at his Requiem for a Dream score.
Mm-hmm.
Although, honestly, I could go with any of his Aronofsky collaborations.
Sure.
I mean, I absolutely love what he does in his style. And then, something that was really awesome and inspiring for me is I got to meet him at this, it was a BMI meetup thing, because I'm a member of BMI.
Sure.
And I got to meet him and I talked to him for a few minutes, and
Very cool.
learned that he composes like me. He's not classically trained. And that just kind of was like, oh, wow, that makes him even all the more better. He makes these huge, just amazing scores. And he's just hunting and pecking and finding things that sound good to fit together.
Isn't that awesome?
And yeah, it's just really cool. I mean, to be able to make such amazing stuff like that, I just think is really, really cool.
I almost think in a way it's more of a testament to the human mind to be able to just by process of trial and elimination find the right combination of really complex pieces when you don't actually automatically know like this scale will work.
Yes, exactly. It opens up like just like the don't think, just do kind of part of the brain, like you're
Right.
actually working. And if it's working, it's working. Who cares if it's this or that or whatever, if it's working, it's working.
Yeah, that's great. It's cool that you got to meet him. That's awesome. And get some feedback from him. That's really cool.
Yeah, for sure.
I'll go with a soundtrack next. And
Okay.
It's funny because I am more of an 80s rock and pop guy. The Single soundtrack, 1992, was a big one for me. All the everything. Jimi Hendrix had the song Waterfalls in there. It was my first introduction to Smashing Pumpkins, and some other things. So I just really enjoyed that soundtrack, and I thought it really fit. And of course, late 20s, people in the 90s going through relationships. At the time, I was in my early 20s. So it was still it was relatable, but also aspirational, if that makes sense. Like I was still like, oh, those are more grown up than me, but
Sure.
but it was relatable. So I enjoyed the movie, even though really the movie, if you take away like the cool sound guard and all that kind of stuff, it's really not that memorable to me, but it's more about the soundtrack.
Sure. Yeah, no, great collection of songs. And yeah, no, absolutely. I might as well stick with you then with a soundtrack. My favorite band is The Cure. I'll
Sure.
tell you that right now. And I discovered The Cure because of the Crow soundtrack. And
Sure.
that soundtrack also just had a ton of other great music. But I mean, I can't have a conversation about favorite scores and soundtracks without bringing it up because of it leading to my discovery of The Cure. And I think I want to say 11 at the time when that came out. But yeah, I mean, just such an important soundtrack album for me.
Yeah, it was a great movie, and and actually it's a product of its time. The only part of that movie that I slightly cringe at is when he sits on the rooftop and starts like sort of shredding on the guitar. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't even remember that. It's been so long since I've actually watched the movie.
It's been years since I've watched it, but there is a part where he sits on and starts playing some sort of like 80s solo.
Nice.
And it's nice, but I'm kind of like, oh, what an obvious pandering nod to what was actually popular 2 or 3 years before. And we tend to forget that the 80s going to the 90s, yes, Nirvana smashed the barriers and killed hair metal and all that kind of stuff. But you tend to forget that there's still a fluctuation period where, okay, what's cool now? There's not you don't slam the door and go, okay, from now on, Van Halen is not cool. You must like Nirvana. It's very much a gradual thing where it takes a couple years to really seep into the culture.
Sure,
So
sure.
that's sort of an obvious nod to me, like, okay, they were still in the early 90s and that's just sort of happening. So
That's awesome. I kind of want to go like YouTube that scene right now. That's fun.
you have to. I can't really remember what he played. I just remember it striking me as that. But, well, I have to go with another score, and it's really only the title track. I know they threw in some standard blues numbers, and I'm not a big blues guy, although I certainly appreciate it. But Mo Better Blues,
Mm.
the title number of that soundtrack is what it's sort of like the signature song of his performances on stage throughout that movie. And it's just, I just love that melody. It's a very simple melody, and I just always really liked it. And that's one of the things that the soundtrack, I certainly enjoy the movie, and I've watched it again and again. It's probably been honestly 15 years since I've seen it, but it's one of those movies where I sat down and watched it 4 or 5 times. And that was mainly just because the soundtrack. It was good acting, good story, but the soundtrack really cemented that together for me.
Mo Better Blues is one of those movies where I feel like I saw it back in high school or something, and I honestly can't remember if I've seen it or not, but I feel like I probably did.
It's
But if I
Spike
did,
Lee,
it was forever.
Spike Lee with Denzel Washington in the lead.
Yeah, I certainly remember it like as a movie. I just don't remember if I actually saw it.
Gotcha. Yeah. It's good. I mean, it's definitely worth a watch, and it's definitely a drama. It's based on a blues band leader losing control of his band and the interband politics and relationship status. It's sort of a slice of life drama, but now what's next on your list for you? Do you have anything else coming up?
So I've got a few more on my list, but I actually just thought of one that
Sure.
I'm going to skip over my list for now and bring up. It's a recent favorite, my favorite score of like the last few years, and that is Nicholas Britell's score from If Beale Street Could Talk, which was an absolutely beautiful score that kind of blends like just really sweet like jazz music with like really kind of like ambient sounds really, and it's just fantastic and just sets the tone so beautifully. And that was last year, and it was definitely my favorite score of last year. And I just figured I'd bring up a really modern one.
Definitely, yeah. That I need that. I tend to get caught in the past. Now I don't know the movie. Are we regarding like Beale Street as in Memphis?
So it's based on a James Baldwin book, and it was what's his name, the director of Moonlight, Barry Jenkins.
Mm-hmm.
It was his follow up to Moonlight, which won the Oscar a couple years back, for Best Picture, and it's another fantastic, beautiful film. And it didn't quite do as well, unfortunately, but it certainly has its fair share of fans, and especially the score. I know I definitely wasn't alone amongst the like the film Twitter community of people that are following along the award season. We were all rooting for it to win, but it did not. But
I don't have a ton of faith always in the Oscars. It's
it's tough. It's a hard thing.
I mean, there's so much. Is the politics and the helping to buy your nomination? I don't know if all that's true, but
yeah, it's true.
Yeah, okay, I figured as much. Especially when you hear like even in the record industry, like you hear managers go, releasing our album in 1981. Okay, what position do you want to come in the charts at? Do you want to come in at the top 10 or number 1 or whatever, so you have room to move up? Like what? Like.
Just how the world works, I guess.
Yep. I'm 47 and still naive, but now I'm going to go with my more obscure reference. A soundtrack I always kind of liked is The Savage Planet. Do you know it?
I have not heard of this. No.
1973. It's an animated film, French. Very weird. A guy named Alain Goraguer. And I'm probably mangling the French pronunciation of that, but you can look it up on YouTube. They have it on YouTube. It's just a weird. It's like an alien planet, and there's little people that look like humans, and there's larger aliens that basically it's basically humans being treated like ants as, we would treat them. And they're just there for the picking and stomping on. And it's just a strange movie. But the soundtrack is pretty unique. A lot of it's indicative of the period, 1973. It's still got some wah-wah guitar and just like French horns and just strange instrumentation. It's weird, but
right on.
Yeah,
right on. Yeah. I have not heard of it, but it sounds really weird and out there and cool. I dig
it is. It's weird.
Right on. Well, I'm gonna go with another score, and we haven't mentioned any female composers, so I figured I'd bring up Anna Meredith's score for 8th Grade, which was just also last year. Fantastic little indie film. And the score is absolutely just bizarre and weird and very current sounding.
Awesome.
It takes a lot of cues from modern pop music, and it's very unique, very different. But it so beautifully captures like the anxiety and like that feeling of this young girl just going through all these, weird adolescent, feelings and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And it does it in a way that I haven't really seen another score do. And it's quite interesting and unique.
Very cool. Yeah. I've not seen that movie either. And I have to be honest, I've been bad about getting to the movies really, a year or two, and it's just life catches up with you, and at some point you start to fall victim to the I've got a big screen and I'll watch it when it comes on streaming or something, but it's not the same experience. But yeah, I'm guilty of that, to be honest.
I know a lot of people who are.
Yeah. But that's cool. I have to look that up. 8th Grade, huh?
Yep.
Very cool. I want to go into a little side note of what are your thoughts on movies that made major use of one song repetitively? You know what I'm talking about? Like it's not so much a score or soundtrack. They just play the same song throughout. Maybe not exclusively, but that's the theme song. And the big example I can think of it's famous as Midnight Cowboy, that Harry Nilsson song that everybody's talking. And it's kind of like that's the song that comes on in every dramatic scene or important scene. But my favorite that I actually grew up with, because Midnight Cowboy was before my time, but my favorite as a child was Kelly's Heroes. Clint Eastwood, Telly Savalas and Don Rickles and Donald Sullivan and all those guys, but they kept playing the same song over and over again called Burning Bridges, or All Those Burning Bridges, I think. And I had to look it up. It's by a group called the Mike Curb Congregation. Are you familiar with the movie?
I am not, no.
Okay. It's interesting. It's I kind of think they got elements of it to steal for the movie Three Kings about 20 years ago.
I know that movie.
It's Clint Eastwood, and he's a lieutenant or whatever in charge of a small company. The captain's never around, and they're just tired of fighting the war, and they find out that there's a bunch of gold in a German bank behind enemy lines, or a French bank behind enemy lines. So they decide, screw it, we're just going to get together a bunch of guys, fight our way through enemy lines, and steal the gold. And that's the whole premise. And they're fighting and doing whatever, and it's got nothing to do with patriotism or winning the war. It's let's get some gold and get ours. Like, I'm not worried about Uncle Sam. I got to look out for me. Kind of an interesting concept, but they use the same score, and it's very, very 60s, late 60s, hippie, early 70s derivative. And I've got a friend that he actually went on to produce several shows in out in Hollywood, TV shows and stuff. Definitely more versed in the film scores and that kind of thing than I am. But years ago, I showed him that movie, and he goes, and thank you for reminding why you don't use current and topical music in a film. Which of course
you have to be an expert in order to do it.
Right. And he's got a good point. I mean, there's a reason why the John Williams score don't sound terrible in 2019. It's because they're classical. When you do the Kelly's Heroes, the leftover 60s hippie thing, it sounds very much like this was released in the early 70s. I like it, but I don't know if I like it because I like the movie.
Well, I'm trying to think of examples of that that thing that you're saying there about a song being used over and over. And I absolutely hadn't planned on bringing this up, but there was a movie this year from Jim Jarmusch called The Dead Don't Die.
I've heard of it,
And are you familiar with Sturgill Simpson?
Yes.
Yeah, he did the theme song. It's a little country song called "The Dead Don't Die," and it plays like at least, I don't know, at least 5 or 6 times through the movie, and they even like reference it, like, "Oh, isn't this the theme song of the movie?" Like in the middle of the movie, like they hear it on the radio and they're like, "Oh, I hate this song. Why do they keep playing this song?" You know,
That's great.
And it's part of the joke of the movie, but
Right.
But yeah, that was like the first thing that came to mind while trying to think of an example of that. I think if I had a little time, I would think of a good one.
I'm sure you would. Yeah, it's one of those things you actually have to come across before you remember it. Like, oh yeah, they use that there. But yeah, I
Sure.
always kind of like your point there. It's always kind of funny when they break the fourth wall down a little bit and
Yeah.
sort of tip their hand like, yeah, get it, and wink and a nod.
Mhm.
But that's pretty cool. Yeah, what else do you have on your list?
Let's see here. Well, I'll go with one more soundtrack.
Mhm.
And this, again, like I said, you know, The Crow was like such a big moment for me with discovering The Cure. Another soundtrack when I was younger that was a big moment for me because it kind of took me from just a kid that didn't really care about music. I mean, music was there, it was cool, but I just whatever, it was music. To just being in love with music, and that was actually the Wayne's World soundtrack, and of
Sure.
course Bohemian Rhapsody. You
Mhm.
know, and that, I mean, that was just such a big moment for me where I like started to get into rock music. I went and got a bunch of Queen, and then went from there to all kinds of other classic rock, and then to current rock of the moment. And yeah, I mean, that was the beginning of me actually really caring about music, was Wayne's World.
Interesting. Yeah, that's cool. And it was definitely a cool movie. And, you know, nobody will admit this, but, and especially now with Bohemian Rhapsody being such a big deal in the last year, the movie, but Queen was a huge band, no doubt.
Yeah.
Then there was a lapse. I mean, they didn't have a ton of radio hits. Bohemian Rhapsody, no doubt. Another One Bites the Dust. And they had 5 or 6 big hits. But they were not on the list of everybody's like, oh, they're one of the best classic rock bands ever. They were not.
Right.
And then
Yeah.
Wayne's World re-brought Bohemian Rhapsody back into the limelight. It was suddenly cool to like that song again. And then it diminished again. And with Bohemian Rhapsody, it's now suddenly like, oh, yeah, we love Queen. Well, yeah, well, you didn't love them 3 years ago. Like, it's
Sure.
and I'm talking about the fair weather fans. I'm not talking about the
Sure.
There's obviously millions of people that have always loved Queen and know every track, but you know, it's just one of those things where it's interesting. It's kind of the analogous to the, you know, Kurt Cobain is the best writer ever. Like, no, he's just dead. You know, and
yeah.
people
It's
can-
just part. It's part of the thing, the cultural thing. you
yeah,
know?
I mean, people can argue that all the time. Like, well, there's no telling what Jimi Hendrix would be doing if he wasn't dead. Yeah, but he might have been making a Burger King commercial. I mean, you don't actually know. Would he have continued to make groundbreaking music? It's hard to tell. But
It's hard to tell.
yeah, but yeah, definitely a great soundtrack on that movie, and I was definitely a fan. And I think I was in the Army when that came out, but it was definitely one of our favorites. I mean, great soundtrack. I was probably the right age for that humor. You know, I really liked it. But Tia Carrere is never bad to look at.
Sure.
What else is on your list, David?
I have another soundtrack here. This one's kind of a deep pull. Actually, another Jim Jarmusch. I didn't expect to bring up Jim Jarmusch twice in one episode, but his film Ghost Dog. So I, in high school, went
Ghost
through a
Dog
pretty
is
big
great. Yes.
Yeah, I went through a pretty big hip hop phase back in high school, and I was like a hardcore hip hop guy for like, I don't know, 3-4 years or something like that.
Mhm.
And I maintain that the Ghost Dog soundtrack is the last truly great hip hop album.
Okay.
I think it is start to finish, whereas a lot of hip hop nowadays is either ranges from unlistenable to, oh, there's a few good songs on the album, but the rest of it's kind of filler. That was the last time I listened to a hip hop album, and I was like, every song, I love this album, everything. And it was mostly Wu-Tang related artists, and the RZA produced it. But yeah, that to me, that's like the last of the great hip hop albums of that era that started in like the early 90s and went to that point.
And that was a great movie too. I mean, it was just fantastic. I mean, what a cool concept. Just let's combine the hood with a samurai aesthetic and Forrest Whitaker and just
Forrest Whitaker is just great.
Yeah, and who would have guessed that from Fast Times? He was just
right.
But it's amazing. But then again, Tom Hanks started on Bosom Buddies, so it's hard to guess what the future potential of people will be. But yeah, that was definitely great. And you're right about hip hop and all that. It's I don't know if it's hard for me to tell. Is it because I've gotten older, but I certainly feel like the beginnings of hip hop and rap had more genuine drive and fury and momentum than it does now. And it probably is partially age related, but I look back at just the rawness of NWA and even just stuff like Eazy-E and Dougie Fresh and just that stuff, and I don't know if it would stand up today, but you've got things like Will Smith. I mean, people would laugh if you came up with a song like "Parents Don't Understand Today," but
it's definitely. I mean, I think age has something to do with it, but at the same time, I can't help but think that stuff was better.
I do. I have to agree with you there. I mean, I think a lot of it was just it was almost like the beginning of a genre can have the same momentum and upward and downward trend that a band can. Like you almost never will say that a band's 18th album is better than their second.
Right.
I mean, it's just not true most of the time. And so I don't know if that's the same for a genre. It can't be an exact correlation, but you know what I'm saying. I want to tie up anything. I mean, what movies are we leaving out that you've got as far as great soundtracks or scores?
The only one I had left on my list actually is Ex Machina, which is one of my other favorite recent scores of like the last 5-10 years. Just absolutely fantastic electronica based score. I'm actually just realizing that I'm leaving out any Trent Reznor, who is a major influence for me. So speaking of electronic scores, I could point to any of his, although especially The Social Network. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, that movie and Trent Reznor goes without saying. Huge influence on tons of people.
Yeah.
Tons of people. And just I was interviewing a band recently, and they've got a little bit of that in there, and they definitely were inspired by some of that early 90s industrial thing. And they had released a video a few weeks ago, and I was like, you totally, you or your director totally got that from Trent Reznor. And he's like, oh, I think we did. He mentioned that. I was like, he stole it. He stole it. He stole that idea. You might not have known it because the guy's probably 25, but I'm like, he stole that idea. It looks great in your video, but he stole it. But
anything that's stolen from Trent Reznor is going to look cool and sound cool.
Right. Oh my gosh. Have you seen Nine Inch Nails brought out Gary Newman on stage for Cars?
Sure. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, what the energy in that! I mean, I just love that. They're just paying homage to a guy that they loved, who was the progenitor of industrial in the '80s.
Yep.
And just giving him another moment in front of 40,000 people, and it's just magic.
So cool.
Yeah, definitely. Well, cool. And I want to make sure that everybody knows where to find your music, find your podcast, et cetera. What do they need to know about David Rosen, your music, piecing it together, et cetera, et cetera?
Absolutely. Well, you can find my music. My website is bydavidrosen.com, and I'm on all the social medias at bydavidrosen. And my albums are on iTunes, Spotify, all that kind of stuff. My most recent album is A Different Kind of Dream. And as far as the podcast is concerned, piecing it together, you could probably find it wherever you're listening to this podcast, and on our website, piecingpod.com. All the social medias at piecingpod. And thanks so much for having me on here, man.
Oh, David, it's been an absolute pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation. We'll have to get together again soon and trade notes on things.
Absolutely. That would be fun.
Perfect. Thanks again.
Absolutely.